10-year-old Abby Whitaker had to stand on her toes just to reach the counter. One arm wrapped tightly around her toddler brother, Milo, who was heavy with exhaustion, while the other held a single carton of milk like it was something breakable and sacred. Her voice was small, but it didn't shake. "Ma'am, can I take this home now? I promise I'll pay for it when I'm older." The cashier didn't smile. She slid the milk back across the scanner as if it were evidence in a trial Abby had already lost. No money, no milk. A few people in line sighed. Someone muttered that this was how scams started. Abby's cheeks burned, but she didn't cry. She just adjusted the toddler on her hip and turned toward the automatic doors, bracing herself for the cold parking lot and the long walk back to the overpass where her mother was waiting. That was when the store seemed to go quiet for a different reason. A tall man in a dark overcoat stepped out from the shadow near the magazine rack. He didn't look rushed. He didn't look angry. He looked certain, the kind of certain that made grown men straighten their shoulders without knowing why. Cade Callahan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Add groceries," he said calmly. "And don't let that child leave without what she came for." The cashier blinked. Someone near the back recognized the name and went pale. Abby didn't know who he was, only that when he looked at her, he wasn't seeing a problem to remove. He was seeing something worth protecting. What Abby couldn't possibly know was this. The man who had just paid for her milk controlled half the docks along the California coast, and when he chose to step into someone's life, he didn't step halfway. And tonight, he had chosen hers. If this moment moved you, don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who believes in second chances. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories every day. Stay with us because this is only the beginning. Abby held Milo tighter as the man came closer. The scent of his coat, not some showy cologne, but the smell of night wind and clean wool. She took half a step back on instinct, her eyes flicking fast for an exit the way she'd learned to do in crowded places. Cade Callahan saw it, and he stopped at once, keeping just enough distance that Abby wouldn't feel cornered. He turned to the cashier, his voice still even, as if he were handling something small, yet each word made the air around the checkout tighten in a strange way. He told them to ring up the diapers, the wipes, some soft food for a little child, a thin blanket, and a few things Abby would need in the morning. No one dared argue. No one asked anything more. When the bags were set neatly on the counter, Cade looked at Abby again, and there was no pity in his eyes, only the steadiness of someone who'd made up his mind and didn't need a long explanation. Abby swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. She didn't know who he was, but she knew the kind of man who made other people shut their mouths. And that kind of man usually came with trouble. Cade extended his hand, not to touch her, only to point to the side, where an empty cart waited, and a wide aisle offered space away from the curious crowd. He said it was cold. She shouldn't keep carrying Milo, and he could get them home. One simple sentence, nothing dressed up. Abby looked down at Milo, then at the glass doors where the parking lot lights blinked. Outside was wind, a long stretch of road, the familiar dark. Inside was harsh light, and eyes like needles pressing into her back. She pulled Milo closer and shook her head. It wasn't the stubborn shake of a child, but the shake of someone who'd memorized the rules of survival. She said her mother told her not to go with strangers. Cade didn't frown. He nodded as if Abby had just stated the most reasonable rule in the world, and said he respected that. A man nearby gave a soft cough, as if to remind Cade that nobody said no to Callahan, but Cade only glanced over, just enough for the man to fall silent at once and turn away. Abby saw that, and her heart started pounding faster. If he could frighten a grown man with nothing but a look, he could do a lot of other things too, and Abby couldn't gamble Milo on anything she didn't understand. Cade said he wasn't going to force her. He just didn't want to see a child carrying her baby brother out to the parking lot in a cold night like this. He asked where her mother was. Abby didn't answer right away. She looked around, checking the people in line, checking the doors, checking even the camera on the ceiling. Cade waited. He waited like a man used to, waiting for other people's answers. Not impatient, not pushing, not pretending to be kind. Abby took another step back, then said very softly that her mother was where they usually slept. She didn't say clearly, only pointed vaguely toward the main road. Cade didn't press. He only told Abby to wait a moment. He took a thin gray business card from his coat pocket. Not glossy, just a name and a phone number. Abby didn't take it right away. Cade set it on the edge of the counter, then nudged it gently toward her, like he was setting down something harmless. Then he picked up the bags they'd just paid for, not placing them straight into Abby's hands, but setting them into the cart beside her, so she could decide for herself whether to take them or not. Abby looked at the bags the way she'd look at a trap wrapped in pretty paper. She'd seen people give and then demand it back, help and then keep score, smile and then turn. But Milo in her arms was rubbing his face into her shoulder with exhaustion, and Abby knew she couldn't cling to pride so hard it turned cruel toward him. She leaned forward and pulled the cart a little closer, but her eyes never left Cade. Cade said he could call them a taxi, or arrange a safe ride. Abby shook her head again. A taxi was still drifting. A taxi was still a stranger. She wanted to walk, because at least she knew the route, and she knew when to run. Cade seemed to understand. He didn't argue. He only asked her name. Abby hesitated for a beat, then said Abby. Milo was Milo. Cade repeated the two names as if he truly meant to remember them, then reminded Abby that if the cold got too bad, she could come back any time. He said there were nights when children shouldn't have to fight on their own. Abby felt her throat tighten, but she swallowed it down. Pity was something that felt good for a second, and stayed dangerous for a lifetime. She pushed the cart toward the doors, walking fast, her head slightly bowed, as if she could disappear from everyone's sight. When the automatic doors opened, cold wind slapped her and Abby shivered. Milo gave a small whimper, squirming like he was about to cry. Abby bit her lip and forced herself to move faster. Behind her, she heard Cade's footsteps, but didn't feel him closing in. He walked slowly, keeping the exact distance he'd promised with his actions. At the step outside the entrance, Abby stopped, her hand gripping the cart handle. She turned back, her eyes both afraid and angry, as if to say, "Don't follow." Cade stopped at the edge of the light and didn't step out into the wind. He looked at Abby for a moment, then lowered his voice, the words not loud, yet going straight to the hardest place inside a child who'd been forced to live like an adult. He told Abby she didn't have to trust him. She only had to pass a message to her mother. He wasn't asking for gratitude, not asking for an address, not asking for anything at all. He was only asking for one warm night. Abby stood frozen. She'd heard plenty of promises, but this one was strange because it demanded nothing from her in return. Milo began to cry, a small sound like a thread tugging Abby back to reality. She looked down at him, then looked up again. The parking lot lights left Cade's face half lit and half in shadow, and it was that shadow that made Abby believe he wasn't the kind of man who only talked well. She pressed her lips tight, her hand trembling on the handle. Then Abby gave the slightest nod, a decision for Milo more than for herself. Cade stayed exactly where he was, his posture deliberate and unthreatening, allowing Abby the space she needed to feel in control. Abby pulled the cart along and walked into the darkness of the parking lot, but this time she didn't run right away. She turned her head back one last time, her voice so small it was almost stolen by the wind, and asked him why. Cade didn't answer at length. He only looked at her, and said there were nights people weren't allowed to turn their backs. Then he repeated it, slowly, each word like a seal pressed into the cold air, that she should tell her mother he wasn't asking for trust, just a few hours of shelter from the biting cold. Abby clenched the business card in her palm, the thin paper feeling as heavy as a door. And for the first time in a very long time, she walked with a strange thought in her mind, that maybe tonight the world wasn't made only of people who looked at her like a problem to avoid. Abby pushed the cart along the edge of the parking lot, trying to keep the wheels from sounding too loud on the rough asphalt. Milo had stopped crying, but he still rubbed his face against her shoulder, his breath fluttering as if he were half asleep. She didn't head straight for the main road. Instead, she chose darker stretches where the lights barely reached, as if darkness itself were what felt familiar and safe. In Abby's palm, the thin business card had softened slightly from sweat, but she gripped it tight, afraid that if she let go, everything that had just happened in the supermarket would dissolve. Cade didn't appear at her side. He kept his distance the way he had on the steps, far enough that Abby didn't feel chased, yet close enough that his tall shape showed up in the glassy reflections of parked cars like a silent outline. Abby glanced over her shoulder a few times, and each time she saw him still moving slowly, as if he were letting her decide everything. She didn't want to lead a stranger anywhere, and she definitely didn't want him to know where they slept, but the promise of a roof and a real bed kept hammering inside her head like wind striking the railing of an overpass. She reminded herself that she'd only take him close, only close enough for her mother to hear the offer, and then she'd pull Milo in and push the cart away at once. no matter how rich the man was or how frightening he might be. Late night, cold out on the street, was different from the cold inside the supermarket freezer. It didn't only sit on skin. It seemed to slip into bone, carrying with it the distant sound of passing cars and the whistle of wind through the gaps between buildings. Abby turned into a narrow path beside a metal fence, where a few low bushes and a dirt track led down beneath the bridge. The damp smell of soil, engine oil, and old trash blended together, but Abby was used to it to the point she didn't even flinch. She stopped at the top of the slope and looked back at Cade again. He stood above, under a streetlight, not coming down right away. Cade looked around, his gaze moving across the dark corners like someone who knew how to read a map of danger, and only then did he walk down slowly, moving only as fast as Abby's comfort would permit. Abby didn't say, "Follow me." She simply turned back and pushed the cart onward, as if refusing to invite him made it less like consent. Under the bridge, the noise bounced back like it was trapped inside a giant box. Tires rolling overhead became a steady, low rhythm, and every so often the long screech of hard braking made Abby startle by reflex. She passed a few tents thrown up in a hurry, a few blue tarps tied with rope, stacks of plastic bins. Someone lifted their head to look, eyes weary but watchful, then looked away when they saw Cade, as if they didn't want to get tangled in the business of a man who didn't belong here. Abby led Cade to a space beside a concrete pillar, where a silver tarp blocked the wind. A few cardboard boxes served as seats, and an old backpack hung from a metal hook. Out of the darkness, a woman stepped forward fast as an arrow, hair tied up in a hurry, a thin coat worn but pulled tight, eyes sharp as a blade. Lauren Whitaker looked at Abby first, not to ask what she'd done, but to check Milo, to scan her daughter's face for any mark, and only then did she look at Cade. In a single beat, Lauren planted herself in front of Abby like a wall, one hand on the cart handle as she tugged Abby slightly behind her. Abby understood at once. She lowered her head a little and turned herself into a shadow behind her mother, the habit of children who know their mother has to fight for the whole family. Cade stopped and didn't step closer. He raised both hands low, palms open, not the posture of surrender but the posture of someone who understood one wrong move could collapse a chance. Lauren didn't offer a greeting. Her voice was low and taut, each word chosen like someone who'd lived with documents and truths. She asked who he was, what he wanted, and why he'd followed her child. Abby opened her mouth to explain, but Lauren lifted one finger, not looking at Abby, yet making it very clear that Abby should stay quiet. Cade said his name. He said he'd met Abby at the supermarket, that she'd been trying to buy milk for her brother, that he'd only paid to help, and wanted to make sure the two children got back somewhere safe. Lauren gave a thin smile, not because it was funny, but because she'd heard too many sentences that began with, "I only wanted to help," and ended with a price. She said flatly that he didn't need to know where they lived, didn't need to know what they lacked, and definitely didn't need to follow a child all the way here. Cade listened to all of it without pushing back. He only looked at Abby once, then looked at Lauren again, and said Abby had told him her mother said not to go with strangers, and he thought that was right. He said he hadn't put them in his car. He hadn't dragged them anywhere. He'd only left food, milk, diapers, and a phone number, in case Lauren wanted to give the children a break from the wind. Lauren tightened her grip on the handle, her eyes sweeping over the cart piled with bags as if she were scanning a debt. She asked why, and this time it wasn't only caution. There was something like wounded pride in it. Cade answered briefly, that he couldn't stand the sight of children having to beg for milk with promises. Lauren curled her lip and asked how many children were out there, why he'd chosen Abby. Cade didn't answer at once, as if the real answer might run too deep. He only said he hadn't chosen. He'd met her, and he'd done what he had to do. Abby stood behind her mother, heart racing, afraid her mother would send him away on the spot, afraid Milo would start crying again, afraid the warmth that had just flickered into existence would go dark like a faulty bulb. Lauren bent to look at Milo and saw her son's face gone pale from cold, saw Abby's hands reddened from holding him so long, and in that moment Lauren's wall trembled, not from softness, but from responsibility. She straightened and glanced around in a quick, restless scan, as if she feared someone was watching, then looked back at Cade, her voice roughening slightly. She asked what he wanted. Cade said he wanted nothing. Lauren snapped back like a knife, that there was no such thing as wanting nothing. Cade remained calm. He said he understood why she didn't believe him, and he hadn't come to make her believe tonight. He only wanted her to hear an offer. He had an empty house, clean, warm, with locks, with blankets, with hot water, just for one night. And in the morning, she could go wherever she wanted. Lauren went silent, her eyes still sharp but now carrying the calculations of someone forced to weigh danger against survival. Abby watched her mother, and for the first time she saw her hesitate for so long. Lauren asked if he planned to take pictures of them, if he planned to call the police, if he planned to use this story to polish his image. Cade shook his head at each question, very slowly, as if signing an oath with his body. Abby couldn't help thinking of the way he'd stepped back at the supermarket door, and it struck her as strange that a man who scared people also knew exactly how to retreat. Lauren looked at the business card in Abby's hand and snatched it quickly, staring at the phone number like an escape route and a trap at the same time. She asked Abby what she'd told him. Abby mumbled that she'd only said they were under the bridge, and she'd only wanted Milo to have milk. Lauren closed her eyes for a beat, as if swallowing anger that didn't belong to her child, then opened them and looked at Cade, her voice turning cold again. She said she didn't accept pity. Cade replied that he didn't call it pity. He called it a chance for them to close their eyes without fear. Lauren let out a soft laugh, and this one sounded like glass breaking, and she said people didn't give warmth away without taking something back. Cade looked straight at her, not dodging, and what he said made Abby's skin prickle. He said what he got back was something he'd lost a long time ago, and tonight he didn't want to lose it one more time. Lauren blinked, as if she'd glimpsed a crack in the man's face, but she immediately tightened again, raising the wall higher. She told him he wasn't allowed to step any closer. He wasn't allowed to look at the children as if they belonged to him, and if he wanted to talk, then he would talk right here, under the roar of traffic, where Lauren could walk away in a second. Cade nodded, accepting his place outside the boundary. He turned to Abby and asked very gently whether Milo could drink the milk right now, and Abby nodded, but her eyes still went to her mother for permission. Lauren hesitated, then shifted just enough to let Abby open a bag. Abby pulled out the carton of milk, hands shaking from cold and nerves. Milo lifted his head, lips puckering as he searched. The sight made Lauren turn her face away slightly, as if she didn't want anyone to see what it did to her. When Milo took his first sips, the noise under the bridge seemed to fall back in Abby's ears, as if the world had narrowed to her brother's breathing and her mother's heartbeat. Lauren looked at Cade again and asked in a low voice what he did for a living. Cade said he managed cargo at the port. Lauren frowned, as if she'd heard it somewhere. She muttered the name of a company, and Cade didn't deny it. Then a man in a nearby tent looked over, eyes widening, and immediately dropped his gaze as if he didn't dare catch Cade's attention. Abby saw that and felt more afraid, but Cade didn't seem to enjoy the fear. He told Lauren he hadn't come to show off power. He'd come to give her a choice. Lauren fired off a question that sounded unrelated but landed like the deepest cut. She asked why a man like him would care about a homeless woman and 2 children with nothing in their pockets. Cade was quiet longer than before, then said simply that there were things money couldn't buy, and tonight he'd seen a child hold on to dignity through a promise. Lauren stood still, pulled between 2 shores, and Abby could feel her mother measuring every risk. In the end, Lauren said she wouldn't go anywhere if it put her children in danger, and if he wanted them to sleep warm, then he had to accept her rules. Cade asked what rules. Lauren said she'd listen to him exactly once, here, right now, and if she agreed, it would be for the children, not for him. Cade nodded, as if that was the only sentence he needed. Abby looked at her mother, looked at Milo, then looked at the man standing outside the boundary. And for the first time she understood that tonight wasn't only about whether there was milk or not. It was the moment her mother had to decide whether the world could contain a door that opened without any trap attached. And Cade Callahan stood there under the growl of traffic overhead, waiting for a permission he wasn't used to waiting for. Lauren stood upright beneath the cold concrete pillar, the traffic overhead still pounding down in a steady rhythm, like a countdown to a decision she couldn't delay any longer. Abby held Milo close, waiting for her mother's answer the way you wait for a verdict. Cade didn't push. Cade didn't crowd her, standing like a pillar that waited to be chosen rather than a predator closing in. Lauren watched him for a long time, as if she were trying to read what lived beneath that calm exterior. At last, she drew a deep breath and said she'd accept the offer, but only for one night, and only if he accepted her conditions. Cade didn't interrupt. He only gave a small nod, as if that was the natural order of things. Lauren said the first condition was that he wasn't to film, photograph, or record anything about her and the children. Not on a phone, not on a camera, not in any file. The second condition was that he wasn't to ask about her past, not about work, not about why she was here, not about anything she hadn't chosen to say on her own. The third condition was that he wasn't to touch her children, not even a pat on the shoulder, without clear permission. Abby heard each condition and felt her heart hammer, because she knew her mother was setting boundaries not only for tonight, but for whatever nights might come after. Cade listened to everything without frowning, without showing irritation. For a moment Lauren almost waited for him to laugh or act offended, because she knew a man like this wasn't used to being given rules. But Cade only took out his phone, opened a notes app, and typed each condition Lauren had just stated, slowly and clearly. He read it back once, his voice even and low, as if they were serious clauses in a real contract. Lauren couldn't hide a flicker of surprise, but she quickly tucked it behind her familiar coldness. Cade said he agreed to all 3 conditions, and if she wanted, he could sign his name right here, even if it was only on the screen. Lauren replied that his signature meant nothing if he didn't keep his word, and Cade looked straight at her and said he'd never kept a promise halfway. The line carried no threat, yet it had a strange weight. Abby glanced at her mother and saw her shoulders weren't as rigid as before, even though her eyes stayed guarded. Lauren asked why he'd agreed so easily, as if searching for a gap in an acceptance that felt too smooth. Cade said what she'd demanded wasn't an insult, it was a mother's right. He added that he understood distance was the only way someone like him could stand in the same space with her, without making her feel threatened. That answer made Lauren pause for a beat, because people rarely looked straight at a truth like that. A powerful man admitting his presence could be a danger. Lauren nodded slowly, as if weighing it one last time. She turned to Abby and asked whether her child agreed. Abby looked at Milo, then looked at Cade. Her eyes weren't as panicked as they'd been in the supermarket, but they were still full of caution. She said it was only for one night, and they'd go back to the old place if it didn't feel right. Lauren squeezed her daughter's hand lightly, as if to steady herself. Cade said he'd have a car come pick them up, but Lauren shook her head right away. She said they'd go with him, but they weren't getting into a private car if she didn't know exactly who the driver was. Cade didn't argue. He called for a company vehicle under his control, stated the driver's name, how old he was, and left Lauren to decide whether to get in or not. While they waited, Lauren watched Cade's hand as he put his phone away. No wedding ring, no showy jewelry, only faint calluses at the knuckles and across the palm, like the hands of someone used to holding something larger than a phone. Those weren't the hands of a man who'd spent his whole life behind a desk. They were the hands of someone who'd given orders and been obeyed. Lauren didn't comment on it, but she filed it away. Cade caught her looking, but he didn't pull his hand back. He let her see, as if he understood trust couldn't come if everything stayed hidden. The traffic overhead kept its steady roar, but down below, the air had changed. It wasn't a sharp standoff anymore. It was a fragile agreement, built on 3 conditions and one warm night. When the vehicle stopped at the top of the slope, and its headlights swept across the open space under the bridge, Lauren turned to Cade again. She said if he broke any condition, she'd disappear with her children before he even understood what had happened. Cade replied that he had no intention of chasing people who didn't want to be found. That answer was just enough for Lauren to step forward, pushing the cart toward the light, Abby close at her side, Milo still quiet in his sister's arms. And when they passed Cade on their way to the car, Lauren felt his restraint with a clarity she couldn't ignore. He didn't step in to take Milo, didn't touch Abby, he only stood there and kept his word from the very first second. It was that restraint that unsettled her more than any promise ever could. The vehicle pulled away from the noise beneath the bridge, rolling through brightly lit streets before gradually slipping into a quieter Santa Monica, where the ocean wind carried salt and a gentler cold that still made Abby tuck herself closer around Milo. Lauren sat upright in the back seat, one hand clenched around the strap of her old backpack as if it were the only thing that truly belonged to her, her eyes fixed on the window to memorize the route, the turns, every landmark, every detail, in case she had to run. Cade sat in front. He didn't turn around much, only occasionally asking a short question about whether Milo was all right, then falling silent again. When the car turned onto a sheltered street, lined with neatly trimmed trees and low houses hidden behind fences, Lauren felt her chest grow heavier. She wasn't used to this kind of quiet, the kind that makes you hear your own heartbeat and the accusing sound of your thoughts. The car stopped in front of a house that wasn't flashy. Light-colored walls, a solid wooden door, a warm yellow porch light, no sign, no grand entrance, only a cleanliness that felt almost too deliberate. Lauren stepped out first, pulling Abby in the cart with her, her gaze sweeping the yard and the darker corners on reflex. She saw a man standing farther off, not approaching, only watching like a shadow on guard. Then she spotted a small camera under the eaves, and another at the corner of the garage. Lauren's throat went dry at once. Instinctively, she remembered her first condition. No filming, no photos, no recording. She spun toward Cade, her voice low but sharp. Cade didn't look surprised, as if he'd expected this reaction. He said the cameras were only for the outer perimeter, so no one could approach without being detected, and there were no cameras inside the living areas unless Lauren agreed. Lauren didn't believe him right away. She walked straight to the door, studied the lock and latch, scanned the corners where devices could hide. Abby stood beside her mother, holding Milo, eyes wide as she took in everything clean and scented with new wood, like she was stepping into a world that didn't belong to her. Cade handed the key to Lauren and didn't open the door for her. Lauren took it, her hand still trembling slightly from cold and strain, and opened the door herself. Inside, the house was warm and quiet. Clean wooden floors, soft lighting, no television noise, no cigarette smell, only a light soap scent and a faint trace of something like tea. Lauren had barely stepped in when she stopped, because right beside the living room a foldable crib had already been set up. A stack of diapers, wipes, a few small outfits hung neatly, and a baby bottle placed on a tray, as if it had been waiting. Abby's mouth fell open, as if a gasp was about to escape. Then she bit her lip and held it back. Lauren stood frozen, with the feeling that someone had stepped into her life before she'd even agreed. She turned to Cade, her eyes flaring. Cade remained calm. He said everything was new, unused, and he only wanted Milo to have a safe place to sleep. Lauren asked who had prepared it. Cade gave a name. Marla Keats. He said Marla managed this house and often prepared for emergencies. Lauren gave a thin smile and asked what kind of emergency came with clothes in Milo's exact size. Cade looked at Milo, then at Lauren, not dodging. He said Marla didn't guess exactly. Marla only prepared broadly, but when he said it, Lauren felt an invisible cord tighten anyway. She remembered what he'd said in the supermarket about not stepping into anyone's life halfway, and she suddenly understood that his version of not halfway could be the most dangerous trap of all. Lauren positioned Abby behind her again, building the wall back up, and said she didn't like the feeling of being arranged. Cade nodded, and then he did something that made Lauren go still. He stepped to the security panel by the door, opened a menu on the screen, and told her she had control. He gave Lauren a temporary code, valid for one night, allowing her to disable the front porch and outer walkway cameras if she wanted, and he showed her clearly that the cameras at the gate and at the back corner couldn't be fully disabled because they were mandatory perimeter coverage, but the data wasn't stored beyond the allowed limit, and no one watched unless an alarm triggered. Lauren stared at him like he'd just handed the keys of a jail to the prisoner. She asked why he was giving her that power. Cade said because she'd set conditions, and he'd agreed. Lauren stayed silent for a moment, then tried pressing the option. A small light changed color. She felt her heartbeat slow a fraction, even though the fear didn't disappear. Abby watched her mother, watched Cade, then looked around the house. She walked into the living room and set Milo down on a soft chair, careful as if she might stain something just by touching it. Milo squirmed, eyes half closed. Lauren looked at her son and guilt rose like a wave, because she knew children weren't supposed to learn how to move quietly inside a home. Cade asked Abby which room she wanted to sleep in. Abby didn't answer right away, only looked down the hallway where a strip of warm light glowed at the far end. Lauren noticed Abby still wore the old hair clip, the one thing the girl had kept from the life before they slid under the bridge, and something pinched in Lauren's chest. She cleared her throat and asked Cade where the bedrooms were. Cade pointed the way, then stopped at the edge of the living room, not going any farther, as if reminding himself of the third condition. Lauren realized he was restraining himself so he wouldn't upset her, and that restraint made it harder to breathe, because it wasn't like the men she'd known. It wasn't kindness performed for praise. It felt like discipline. They walked down the hall to a small bedroom prepared with thick blankets, soft pillows, and a star-shaped nightlight on the bedside table. Abby froze at the sight of the little lamp, as if that star were a luxury. Lauren scanned the room, then noticed another small camera on the hallway ceiling outside the door, and panic surged again. She turned back at once. Cade stood in the living room and didn't follow close. Lauren said she wanted quiet hours, no one coming in, No noise, no one watching, at least while Abby slept. Cade nodded without arguing. He made a brief call, his voice not loud but carrying a tone that made it clear whoever listened had to comply. He said from now until morning, no one was to enter this area, no one was to ring the bell, no one was to make noise, and if there was an emergency, only one person was allowed to approach, and that person had to remain outside the door until Lauren gave permission. When he ended the call, he looked at Lauren and said quiet hours would begin the moment Abby closed the bedroom door. Lauren stared at him, angry and confused at the same time. His power here wasn't in ordering her around. It was in making the whole world around them fall silent so she could breathe. Abby placed Milo into the foldable crib, pulled a blanket over him, then stood still and watched him for a long moment, as if she feared he would vanish the second she turned away. Lauren drew Abby close and set a hand on her daughter's shoulder, then remembered the third condition, remembered that Cade wasn't allowed to touch the children, and she suddenly realized that even she was starting to feel haunted by that rule, like a warning sign planted in her mind. She walked back to the living room, looked at Cade, and said clearly that this was only one night, and in the morning she'd decide what came next. Cade replied that she didn't have to promise anything. He only reminded her of one simple thing, that tonight the only goal was for Abby and Milo to sleep. Lauren stood still, her eyes drifting again to what had been set up, the items so perfectly matched to need as if someone had read her life. She asked whether Marla had prepared everything before he met Abby or after. Cade said after, but he didn't answer immediately. He said Marla didn't ask much. She only heard him say there was a baby and an older child, and she did her part as if it were simply normal. Lauren clenched her hands, feeling both rescued and fitted into a frame she hadn't agreed to, and she wanted to fight against it. But when she heard, from the bedroom, Abby's soft, shushing voice, small but steady, Lauren knew she couldn't smash a warm night out of pride alone. She watched Cade's hand where it rested lightly against the back of a chair, never moving closer, never crossing the boundary. That hand had calluses as plain as truth. A hand used to holding, used to controlling, used to giving orders, and being obeyed. Lauren suddenly understood that her fear wasn't only about cameras or a house that was too clean. It was that this man had power large enough to turn a promise into reality, and when power stood in front of her, she didn't know whether it would protect her or swallow her whole. Cade looked at Lauren as if he could read the panic she was trying to hide behind hard eyes. He told her she could lock her bedroom door, lock even the front door if she wanted, and the security code was in her hand. He repeated that he'd written down her conditions, and he would keep them. Lauren didn't reply. She turned away and walked down the hallway, checking Abby's door lock one more time. When she heard Milo's steady breathing in the crib and saw Abby curled on the bed, her face still tight like she hadn't dared to believe, Lauren pulled the blanket up over her child and stood there watching for a long time. Out in the living room, Cade remained where he was, unmoving, like a shadow that kept its word. And in that quiet, Lauren realized the biggest test of tonight wasn't security or cameras. It was that she had to learn how to sleep in a house with a man powerful enough to make anything happen, who had chosen, instead, to do nothing except step back exactly one pace. The night gradually settled over the quiet house in Santa Monica, the distant sea wind replacing the thunder of traffic under the bridge, and Lauren sat alone at the dining table with her old backpack tucked beneath her feet, a habit she couldn't break. She couldn't sleep, even though the room at the end of the hallway had gone still with the steady breathing of Abby and Milo. The kitchen light spilled across the tabletop where a few thin folders and a tablet lay. Lauren hadn't meant to pry, but when she stood to find a glass of water, her eyes caught an open file by accident, and in the corner was the name Harbor Crest Logistics. The name wasn't unfamiliar to her. It had appeared in freight disputes she'd handled years ago, cases tied to the port, contracts, and money trails nobody ever spoke about plainly. Lauren stopped, her heartbeat slowing, but growing heavier. She didn't touch the file right away. She only stared, as if the name alone was warning enough. Cade came in from the living room, not surprised to find her still awake. He remained by the window, giving her the space she needed to breathe, his gaze sliding to the open folder and then back to Lauren. She didn't circle around it. She asked if Harbor Crest Logistics was his. Cade didn't dodge. He nodded. Lauren let out a soft laugh, not from joy, but because that confirmation made several pieces in her mind click into place. She asked what he managed inside that company. Cade said he ran the port lanes, the ship schedules, the containers. the things that arrived and left every day that most people never thought about. Lauren studied him longer, searching his voice for a hint of boasting or threat. There was none, only facts delivered like ordinary data. She asked why people were afraid of him. Cade didn't answer right away. He walked to the sink, poured himself a glass of water, then said people were afraid because he could lock their doors. Lauren frowned. Cade explained, simply, that if a store, a company, or an entire supply chain depended on goods arriving on time, in the right place, then the person who controlled that flow could make a door open or shut. He didn't need to threaten anyone. He only had to say no. A different kind of cold moved along Lauren's spine, not the fear of being hurt, but the recognition of what economic power could do when it tightened. She'd watched small businesses collapse because a contract was pulled. Cade set his glass down, his expression calm, as if he were talking about the weather. Lauren asked if he'd ever used that power to punish someone. Cade said he didn't like the word punish. He only adjusted the balance when it was necessary. The answer didn't comfort her, but it didn't carry violence either. Right then, Cade's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and answered, his voice low and clipped. On the other end was a manager from a local grocery chain. Someone who'd refused to accept a shipment on paper for procedural reasons, but, in truth, because of rumors about Lauren and the children. Lauren couldn't make out every word, but she heard how Cade didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten. He only asked one question, whether that manager was sure he wanted his stores closed for the weekend. There was a brief silence, and then the voice on the other end shifted instantly, apologies spilling out, insisting it had all been a misunderstanding and the shipment would be processed that same night. Cade ended the call as if nothing had happened. Lauren looked at him and understood that was how he worked. No gunfire, no fists, only a phone call that made other people correct themselves. She asked if he did that often. Cade said only when he had to. Lauren sat back down, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. She realized the world she'd once left behind hadn't vanished. It had only changed its shape. Before, she'd faced men in suits inside boardrooms. Now she was facing a man who didn't need a boardroom to steer an outcome. Abby appeared in the kitchen doorway, her eyes still heavy with sleep. She asked quietly if her mother was okay. Lauren nodded and told her to go back to bed. Abby glanced at Cade for a moment, then turned away without another word. The silence between Lauren and Cade stretched on, but it wasn't as tight as before. Lauren said she'd been a paralegal, that she'd handled files tied to freight companies and seaports. She said the name Harbor Crest had surfaced in a major dispute once, and then it disappeared from the list of entities under investigation. Cade didn't deny it, and he didn't explain. He only said there were things on paper that didn't reflect the whole truth. Lauren asked whether one of the reasons she'd disappeared from the profession was that she'd touched names like that. Cade looked at her, not avoiding her eyes, but not confirming anything either. He said he didn't know her past, and he respected the conditions she'd set. Lauren suddenly realized she'd almost violated her own second condition. She drew in a deep breath and stepped back from the story of herself. She said that no matter what, she didn't want her children growing up in a world where power was measured by who could lock whose doors. Cade replied that he didn't want that, either. He said he wanted the children to sleep without fearing wind sliding through the cracks of a bridge. The words left Lauren quiet. She didn't know if he meant them or if they were part of a softer strategy, but she knew he had the ability to turn words into action. When Lauren stood to go back to the bedroom, the phone inside her backpack began to buzz. The sound rang through the quiet space like an alarm bell. Lauren froze, her heart jumping. Not many people had this number. She opened the backpack and looked at the screen. An unknown number. Cade didn't ask who it was. He only watched her, waiting for her reaction. Lauren swallowed hard, her hand trembling slightly as she pressed to accept the call. And in that instant, she understood that one warm night didn't mean the past had stopped coming for her. Lauren lifted the phone to her ear, her heart pounding so hard she was afraid Cade could hear it, too. On the other end was a man's voice, low and smooth as velvet, the kind of voice that once belonged in polished wood boardrooms and in front of expensive suits. Derek Halston didn't need to say his name, because Lauren recognized him instantly. That voice had been the door that led her into the profession, and it had also been the hand that shoved her out without mercy. Derek didn't bother with a long greeting. He only asked how she'd been living lately, and whether the choices she'd made recently had left her with any regret. Lauren straightened her back, her eyes drifting without thinking toward the hallway where Abby and Milo were sleeping. She asked what he wanted. Derek gave a soft laugh and said he only cared about the reputation of their former office and about the people who'd once worked under him. He said the name Lauren Whitaker still existed in a few files that hadn't been closed, and if she wasn't careful, it could surface at the exact moment she least wanted it to. Lauren tightened her grip on the phone until her fingernails dug into her skin. She asked what he was threatening. Derek answered in the polite language of lawyers, talking about confidentiality obligations, procedural violations, responsibility when handling internal documents. He brought up that incident from years ago, when a set of files disappeared from the system, and every piece of evidence pointed to Lauren. He didn't say outright that she'd stolen anything or done wrong. He only emphasized that her image in the legal world had been badly damaged, and if she tried to come back, there would be questions she couldn't easily answer. Lauren felt her stomach clench. She remembered that day clearly, remembered how her Access account had been used after hours, remembered being called into a meeting room and confronted with a printout bearing an electronic signature with her name on it. She'd tried to explain, but Derek had stood and said the office couldn't keep someone who worked so carelessly. One sentence, and her career ended. Derek continued, saying he'd heard she was in contact with certain people connected to old shipping routes, and he didn't want her embarrassing anyone again. Lauren understood immediately that he meant Cade. He added that in the worst case, he could be forced to resubmit the old file to the professional board to clarify responsibility. And then the questions wouldn't stop at work. He mentioned stable living conditions for small children. He mentioned that courts often considered housing when evaluating custody. Every word was coated in sugar and hit a blade. Lauren looked toward the bedroom and felt the blood in her body turn cold. She asked if he planned to drag the children into this. Derek said he wasn't doing anything. He was only letting the system operate the way it was supposed to. If a mother had no fixed address, no stable income, and a history tied to a confidentiality violation, the system would raise questions on its own. He said he only wanted to avoid trouble for everyone, and the best way was for Lauren to keep disappearing, the way she had all this time. Lauren could hear her own breathing through the phone, heavy and quick. She knew he was rebuilding the old trap, using the law itself as a rope. She told him he knew she hadn't done anything wrong, that her account had been accessed without permission. Derek went quiet for a beat, then said in a voice that sounded almost regretful that in this line of work, truth didn't always matter as much as the record. The call ended when he told her to think carefully, because one wrong decision could cost her more than a brief moment of borrowed comfort. Lauren lowered the phone, her hand trembling slightly. Cade didn't ask what had been said. He only looked at her face and knew enough. Lauren said the name Derek Halston, her voice breaking out of somewhere deep and sealed. She said he'd been her supervisor, and he'd set her up with an altered file to push her out of the profession. She said she'd been pregnant with Milo then. Pressure piled on pressure, and she hadn't had the money to hire her own attorney to defend herself. Cade listened to everything without changing expression. Lauren moved quickly toward the hallway, opened the bedroom door, and looked at Abby and Milo as if she needed to memorize every detail. She said she couldn't stay here, that if Derek knew where she was, he'd find a way to prove she wasn't fit to be a mother. She started stuffing things into her backpack, movements rushed, eyes wide with panic. Abby woke at the noise and asked what was happening. Lauren only said they had to leave right now. Cade stepped a little closer but still kept his distance, his voice low and steady. He didn't stop her, didn't tell her she was wrong. He only said she could leave if she wanted, but she shouldn't leave without a plan. The words made Lauren freeze mid-motion with the zipper. Cade said running into the night wouldn't make Derek stop, and if he was determined to use the law as a threat, the only way through was to be ready to meet him with the law. Lauren looked at Cade, furious and desperate at the same time. She said she'd tried to face it once and she'd lost. Cade replied that last time she'd been alone. Now she wasn't alone. He didn't say he would strike back. He didn't say he would teach Derek a lesson. He only said he had people who understood the system, lawyers who knew how to read the fine print and find the fracture points. Lauren felt tears rising, but she wouldn't let them fall. Abby climbed out of bed and stood beside her mother, gripping her coat with both hands. She asked if they were going back under the bridge again. The question hit Lauren like a knife to the chest. She looked at her daughter, then at Milo, still sleeping, and she realized that running right now wasn't protection anymore. It was repeating the same old circle. She turned back to Cade. He stood there, neither stepping forward nor retreating, like a pillar waiting to be chosen or refused. Lauren drew a deep breath and set the backpack down on the floor. She said she didn't know how much she could trust him, but she knew she couldn't keep running. Cade nodded, his voice low but clear, and said that if she had to leave, he wouldn't stop her. But if she stayed, he wanted her to stay with a plan. And for the first time since she'd stepped into this house, Lauren didn't feel cornered. She felt herself standing at a crossroads with a faint light somewhere ahead, even if that road might lead straight into the battle she'd been afraid of most. Lauren still stood in the middle of the living room with her backpack half-zipped, her breathing still quick after Derek's call, while Cade remained a silent presence in the background, careful not to cast a shadow over her. The silence between them was no longer simple suspicion. It was the quiet that comes right before a decision. Cade didn't offer any more promises. He only took out his phone, walked to the window that looked out on the yard, and spoke a name in that familiar low voice, Owen Vance. Lauren didn't know who Owen was, but the way Cade spoke now was nothing like the earlier call in the kitchen. This wasn't a reminder sharp enough to make a manager apologize. It was an exchange between two people who understood the system. Cade said, briefly, that a lawyer named Derek Halston was considering using an old file to apply legal pressure, that they needed to review every piece of data tied to a firing from years ago, and that he wanted to know where the weakness was before the other side had time to file anything. Owen didn't ask many questions. He only said he'd check corporate records, old contracts, and any connection between Derek and shipping routes or clients tied to Harbor Crest. Cade ended the call, then made another. Tessa Rowe, a woman's voice answered, calm and professional. Cade introduced the situation in short strokes, that he needed someone who understood professional responsibility law and the procedure for complaints to the bar. Lauren heard words like bar complaint, discovery request, subpoena, and she realized Cade wasn't planning to threaten Derek into silence with anything dirty. He was building a different line of defense, quiet but capable of making a man like Derek uneasy. Lauren stepped closer without meaning to, not noticing she'd crossed the distance. She asked what Cade was doing. Cade said he was preparing. Lauren shook her head, her voice tightening. She said she didn't want him using his power to choke anyone. She didn't want a war between two men that turned her children into a bargaining chip. She told him plainly that she didn't use dirty power. Cade looked at her. There was no anger in his eyes, and no contempt. He asked whether she thought Derek's threat to use an old file was clean. Lauren bit her lip and didn't answer. Cade went on, saying that if Derek chose the law as a weapon, then they would use the law as a shield. No gunfire, no threats, only the right documents in the right place, and someone who knew how to ask the right questions at the right time. Lauren said she didn't want anyone going bankrupt or losing their job just because they were connected to her. Cade replied that he didn't destroy people unless they stepped into that position themselves. He said he only wanted to rebalance what had been twisted for years. Lauren looked at him and recognized the difference between a man who wanted revenge and a man who wanted to contain damage. She still wasn't at ease. She asked who Tessa was. Cade said Tessa was an independent attorney, not part of his company, with experience handling professional ethics complaints. He said that if Derek had altered records or created the conditions for data to be changed, that was a serious violation, and a complaint to the bar could force an investigation to reopen. Lauren blinked as old memories rolled back over her like surf. She remembered asking for system login history, and being denied because she lacked authority. She told Cade that back then she hadn't had access to the servers. She hadn't had her own lawyer. She hadn't had anyone behind her. Cade said that was exactly why they needed a plan this time. He said Owen would review the contracts Derek had touched, especially anything tied to shipping, to see whether there were conflicts of interest or hidden misconduct. Not to ruin him, but to make Derek understand he no longer had a monopoly on threats. Lauren stepped back a pace, feeling as if she stood between two worlds. On one side was the instinct to run, the instinct that had saved her more than once. On the other side was the offer to stay and fight in the way she'd once been trained to fight. She asked Cade if he was ever afraid. Cade said fear was a reflex, but abandoning someone you could protect was a choice. Lauren fell silent. She looked down the hallway where Abby and Milo slept, then turned back to Cade. She said that if he did this, she wanted everything transparent. She wanted to know every step. She didn't want to be placed behind his back. Cade nodded and said she would be the one to decide whether to file a complaint or not, and he would only provide tools. Lauren drew in a deep breath and felt, for the first time in years, that she might get a chance to look back at her own record without bowing her head. But the worry was still there. She said that if Derek realized she was pushing back, he could escalate. Cade replied that if he escalated, He would leave traces, and traces were what Tessa was best at finding. Lauren studied him for a long time, searching for any sign of aggression, of anger ready to burst. She saw only focus, and a cold kind of discipline. Cade added one more line, his voice low but clear. If she didn't want to use dirty power, then they would use clean tools. He had those tools. Lauren didn't know whether to feel relieved or afraid of that certainty. But she knew one thing. This fight was no longer a chase through the night. It was a chessboard where every move would be calculated in advance. And for the first time since Derek had called, Lauren didn't feel completely cornered. The next morning, when pale sunlight spilled through the curtains of the Santa Monica house, Lauren was already seated at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, slowly going cold, while Abby hovered in the bedroom doorway wearing the sweater Marla had set out, her hand smoothing a crease, as if she were afraid to wrinkle something too new. Milo was still asleep, breathing evenly in the foldable crib beside the bed. Last night had passed more quietly than Lauren expected, but the quiet made her wary, as if peace held too long always came with a bill. Abby walked into the kitchen, her eyes searching for her mother before she noticed Cade by the window, speaking softly to someone through an earpiece. Cade paused when he saw Abby, and gave a small nod of greeting, as if she were an equal and not a child. Abby nodded back, then turned to her mother and asked if she had to go to school today. The question made Lauren pause for a beat, because it had been a long time since she'd heard her daughter speak about school as if it were a given. Lauren said that if Abby wanted to, they could try. She didn't promise anything long-term. She only said one day. Abby nodded, but worry flickered in her eyes. When Lauren helped her tie her shoes, Abby asked in a low voice what she should say if the teacher asked for an address. Lauren squeezed her daughter's shoulder and said they were staying at a friend's house for now, and that was the truth. Abby looked down at her shoes and nodded, but she didn't look fully convinced. Lauren realized that Cade must have used his influence with the school board, as the usual red tape for families in transition seemed to vanish overnight. Lauren felt her heart tighten. She didn't like how quickly things were being arranged, but she also knew that every day Abby wasn't in school was another step backward. They drove to the school mid-morning, after the students were already in class. Lauren held Abby's hand tighter than usual. The front office was bright and smelled of new paper, the steady hum of a printer filling the space. The teacher in charge was a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Caldwell, gray streaks gathered into a neat bun, eyes kind without being overly curious. She shook Lauren's hand, then bent down to Abby's level and asked what kinds of books she liked to read. She didn't ask for an address right away. She didn't ask about circumstances. She only asked about books. Abby hesitated, then said she liked stories where someone found their way home. Mrs. Caldwell smiled and said the class was reading one like that. Lauren watched the way the teacher guided Abby into the room, introducing her as a new student transferring from another area, without emphasizing anything else. No one looked at Abby like a problem. No one whispered. Abby sat at a desk with her hands placed neatly, her eyes still cautious, yet a small thread of hope had appeared. Lauren stood outside the classroom door for a long time, watching her daughter try to breathe the way other children breathed. She turned away when the bell rang, her chest feeling light and heavy at once. Cade waited in the hallway and didn't ask how she felt. He only said the school had support programs for families in temporary situations, and if Lauren wanted, he wouldn't interfere further. Lauren said she wanted to do her part herself. Cade nodded, as if that was the answer he'd been waiting for. That afternoon, when Abby was picked up, she said very little, only that the teacher had let her borrow a book and that one classmate had shared colored pencils. But Lauren noticed a small change in the way Abby walked, no longer folded in on herself as if she were afraid of taking up space. That night, after Milo was asleep, Abby sat on the bed and looked toward the window where the streetlight cast a thin stripe of yellow across the room. Lauren sat beside her and gently smoothed hair that had been brushed neat. Abby didn't look at her mother right away. She said softly that today at school she hadn't had to lie about an address, but her heart still raced every time the teacher called her name. Lauren asked why. Abby hesitated, then admitted she was afraid they'd have to go back under the bridge. The words were quiet but clear, like a truth held in for too long. Lauren felt her throat tighten. She pulled Abby into her arms and held her closer, not from fear of losing her, but because she understood this child had carried more than any child should have to carry. Abby said she didn't want to fall asleep to the roar of traffic overhead again. She didn't want to keep watching for drafts in the night. She didn't want to keep wondering whether there would be milk tomorrow. Lauren closed her eyes and breathed in the scent of her daughter's hair. And in that moment she understood that every fight with Derek, with the past, with the system, was no longer only about her dignity. It was about Abby's sleep. She told her daughter she wouldn't promise anything except that she wasn't going to give up anymore. Abby asked if her mother was scared. Lauren said yes, but being scared didn't mean stopping. In the living room, Cade stood quietly, watching the light through the crack of the door. He couldn't hear every word, but he understood enough. The warmth of a single school day didn't erase the danger waiting ahead. But it gave Lauren a clear reason not to turn her back. When Abby lay down and hugged the borrowed book against her chest, Lauren stayed beside her a little longer, listening to her daughter's steady breathing, then whispered to herself that she would stand up again, this time not only to survive, but to give her children a place they could truly call home. The first hearing took place in a stark white room, folding chairs set in rows and a long table at the front where 3 members of the professional committee turned page after page as if the documents were numb, unfeeling paper. Lauren walked in with Tessa Rowe, her legs feeling heavy as lead, and Cade stopped in the back row, just as he'd promised. Not moving forward, not touching her shoulder, only standing there like an invisible anchor. Abby was at school, Milo was being watched by Marla, and Lauren knew that today she had to face this alone, with her real name and her real past. When the chair called Lauren Whitaker, his voice was even and neutral, but to Lauren it carried the drag of years she'd tried to forget. The first questions circled the altered file, the login times, the responsibility for supervising internal materials. Lauren answered in a voice she worked to keep steady, saying her account had been accessed after hours, that she'd reported her suspicions but they hadn't been examined. A committee member asked why she hadn't pursued a formal complaint back then. Lauren drew a deep breath and said she'd been pregnant and had just been suspended, with no income to hire her own attorney. When the word pregnant left her mouth, memory surged in too fast to stop. She remembered standing in Derek's glass office, one hand resting on a belly that didn't yet show, hearing him say the workplace demanded total focus and had no room for mistakes. She remembered colleagues' eyes sliding away when the rumor spread that she'd leaked documents. She remembered the internal email announcing her termination for a confidentiality breach, polite in tone but final enough to shut every other door. She remembered the job calls afterward, the way a recruiter's voice changed the moment they heard her name. A blacklist didn't need a public announcement. It only needed shared silence. Lauren pulled herself back into the hearing room when another question hit, demanding that she explain why her electronic signature appeared on the final printout. She spoke about how the system hadn't required 2-factor authentication, then spoke about the possibility that someone with higher access had used her credentials. One committee member frowned and asked whether she had evidence. Lauren shook her head and felt her stomach drop. She knew this was the weakness. Without proof, words became only defense. Tessa sat beside her, taking notes with calm precision, occasionally sliding a document forward to remind the committee that there had been known gaps in the security process at that time. But the questions kept coming, pressing on personal responsibility, on whether Lauren had signed to confirm she'd read the policies. Lauren felt as if she were being dragged back to that same old day when every gaze landed on her with suspicion. In the back row, Cade stood tall with his hands held in front of him, not saying a single word. He didn't interrupt, didn't object. He only stayed present like a windbreak, and that silence was what let Lauren pull in a deeper breath each time she felt herself about to choke. A committee member asked whether she admitted she'd been careless. Lauren looked straight ahead and said she admitted she hadn't had enough power to protect herself, but she did not admit she'd done wrong. The answer left the room quiet for a beat. After more than an hour, the hearing paused so the committee could review additional material. Lauren stepped into the hallway, her hands icy even though the air wasn't cold. She leaned against the wall and closed her eyes for a moment. Cade came a little closer but still kept the respectful distance. He asked if she was okay. Lauren gave a small laugh and said she was used to being pressed with questions, but her voice carried a fatigue she couldn't hide. She said she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to stand in front of people who judged her like a file. Cade said not everyone was against her. They only needed something they could touch. Lauren replied that all she had was her word. Right then, Tessa's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen and her eyes brightened slightly. She said something interesting had just been found in the review of old data. A fragment of an email had been deleted from an internal chain back then, but a backup on a secondary server still carried traces. The content showed that Lauren's account had been accessed from an IP address tied to Derek's office on the night before the file was altered. Lauren went still, the air around her seeming to thicken. Tessa said they couldn't conclude anything yet, but this was a thread worth pulling hard. Cade looked at Lauren and didn't offer a victory speech. He only gave a slight nod, as if confirming that the fight might have an opening. Lauren felt her legs stop trembling, even though the road ahead was long. When they left the building, the sky outside was a thin gray, and for the first time since she'd walked into the hearing room, Lauren didn't feel like she was falling through empty air. But she knew one fragment of email wasn't enough to change everything, and what waited ahead was still a road where every step would have to be careful. 2 days after the first hearing, while Lauren was still trying to hold herself steady under the news about the deleted email fragment, she received a call from Abby's school in the middle of the afternoon. The office staffer didn't sound panicked, but the tone was serious enough that Lauren felt her stomach drop. She was asked to come in to meet the vice principal that same day. Cade was in the living room, reviewing documents with Owen, when he saw the color leave Lauren's face. He didn't ask much. He only said he'd take her to the school. Lauren started to refuse, then nodded, because she didn't want to walk into that building alone in this state. The elementary school was bright with afternoon sun, the playground loud with children. But Lauren stepped through the gate feeling as if every eye was on her. Inside the office, Mrs. Caldwell was there too, her expression serious but not cold. On the desk lay a white envelope with no sender's name. The vice principal said the school had just received an anonymous letter implying that Lauren had violated professional ethics and wasn't fit to raise young children in a stable environment. The wording was careful, not a direct accusation, but it raised enough doubt to stir fear. Lauren listened and felt her hands go cold. She knew immediately who was behind it, even though his name wasn't on the page. What frightened her most wasn't her reputation. It was the way people might start looking at Abby differently. She asked whether Abby knew about it. Mrs. Caldwell said another parent had heard a rumor and asked their child, and the story had spread through a few kids. Abby hadn't said anything in class, but the teacher had noticed she'd been quieter than usual. Lauren felt her heart tighten, as if a fist had closed around it. She pictured Abby sitting at her desk, hearing whispers she didn't fully understand, yet still feeling the difference in the air. Lauren asked what the school planned to do. The vice principal said they wouldn't reach conclusions based on an anonymous letter. They had a responsibility to verify information, but they also had a responsibility to protect a student from baseless accusations. She said she believed the process had to be handled properly. Mrs. Caldwell slid the envelope toward Lauren and said she thought Lauren should read it before the school took any step at all. Lauren opened the letter, and each line felt chosen on purpose to plant doubt, mentioning the old investigation, mentioning that Lauren hadn't had a fixed address before, implying that Abby's current living situation might not be appropriate. There was no evidence, only questions placed in exactly the right places. Lauren looked up, met the vice principal's eyes, and said she was already involved in an official process to clarify what had happened years ago, and that there had been no ruling against her. The vice principal nodded and said the school would wait for the outcome from the proper authorities rather than trust an anonymous letter. In that moment, Lauren felt part of the weight lift. When they stepped into the hallway, Abby was standing at the far end with her backpack hugged close, searching for her mother in the crowd. Lauren walked to her and knelt to Abby's level. Abby asked quietly if she'd done something wrong. Lauren shook her head and said it wasn't her fault. Abby said a classmate had asked whether her mom had been fired for doing something bad. Lauren swallowed hard and forced her voice to stay calm. She said adults sometimes disagreed with each other, and there were stories that hadn't been fully told yet. Abby watched her mother longer than usual, as if she were measuring the truth in her eyes. When they left the school, Cade was still outside in the yard. He hadn't gone into the office. He hadn't spoken to anyone. Lauren told him briefly what had happened. She half expected him to say he'd call someone, that he'd make the letter disappear, but Cade only asked what she wanted to do. Lauren said she wanted to handle it through the proper channels. She didn't want anyone thinking she'd used power to silence a school. Cade nodded and said he wouldn't intervene unless she asked. That restraint made Lauren feel grateful and tense at the same time. That evening, Abby sat at the dining table longer than usual, drawing a house with windows glowing with light. Lauren looked at the drawing and saw the fear Abby hadn't put into words. She feared that if the rumors kept spreading, the school could change its tone, could begin asking deeper questions, could take away the chance Abby had only just touched. Lauren stood on the porch for a while, breathing the salty ocean air, telling herself that this fight wasn't only in hearing rooms, it was also in places like this, where her name could reach straight into her child's future. Inside, Cade watched through the glass door and didn't step out, didn't press his presence onto her. He gave Lauren room to decide, to choose how she wanted to face this sideways strike. And Lauren understood that this time, if she stepped back, Abby would learn how to step back too. So she went back inside, placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, and said that some letters were written to make people afraid. But truth didn't live inside an envelope. It lived in how they kept walking forward. The next afternoon, after Lauren had just returned from the school and Abby was seated at the dining table doing homework, the doorbell rang twice, short and decisive. It wasn't the hurried knock of a delivery driver, and it wasn't the long, lingering ring of a stranger who didn't know when to stop. Cade was standing near the window. His expression shifted slightly, but it didn't tighten with panic. He glanced at the small security monitor beside the door, and then looked at Lauren. She saw the image of a man in a dark jacket, a police badge catching the light on his chest. Lauren felt her heart clamp down, but not from fear of being arrested. She feared the way her name, Abby's name, and Cade's name were starting to overlap in more public spaces. Cade asked if she wanted him to open the door. Lauren shook her head. This was about her. She drew in a deep breath and stepped forward, opening it herself. The man introduced himself as Detective Ross Keenan. His voice was calm, not rude, but his eyes were sharp, taking in details. He said he wanted a few minutes to talk about some recent information involving Derek Halston and a few individuals connected to Harbor Crest Logistics. Lauren knew immediately whose name sat at the center of that sentence. Ross glanced past Lauren's shoulder and saw Cade standing a few steps back, not moving closer. Ross's gaze lingered on Cade longer, as if he'd known the man before today. Lauren stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door closed behind her so Abby wouldn't hear. Ross said he'd received an unofficial report that Lauren might be under legal pressure, and that Callahan's presence in the picture made everything more complicated. The way he spoke wasn't an accusation, but the implication was plain. Lauren understood this was the moment when most people would deflect, would say they were only staying somewhere temporarily, that they didn't know anything about the man behind them. But Lauren was tired of deflecting. She looked Ross straight in the eye and said she had chosen to accept help, that no one had forced her, no one had bought her. She said she knew Cade Callahan's reputation, and she knew what she was doing. Ross's brow tightened slightly, as if he hadn't expected that kind of honesty. He asked if she understood that being tied to a man like Cade could make authorities ask questions. Lauren said that if authorities had questions, she was willing to answer, but she wouldn't pretend she was being exploited just to make the situation look simpler. Behind the glass, Cade remained still, not inserting himself, not showing irritation at the way Ross spoke about him. Ross shifted his gaze from Lauren to Cade, and then back to her. He said he wasn't here to arrest anyone or threaten anyone. He only wanted to warn her that Derek Halston wasn't the kind of man who backed down when challenged. He said there were signs Derek was preparing a legal move, possibly a formal complaint or a civil action meant to seize the advantage first. Lauren felt the blood in her body turn cold. She asked what? Exactly. Ross said he didn't have the authority to share details, but he knew how lawyers like Derek operated. If Derek filed first, he'd control the pace, control the narrative, and force Lauren to chase after proof of innocence instead of moving proactively. Lauren looked down at the porch step for a second, then lifted her eyes again. She asked why Ross was telling her this. Ross said he'd seen too many cases where people without resources got crushed by procedure and time. He said he didn't care who Lauren stayed with, as long as she understood the game that was being played. Lauren nodded, sensing that his bluntness didn't smell like a threat. It felt like a neutral warning. Ross looked toward the glass door, where Cade stood, and lowered his voice a fraction. He said Callahan could protect her in his own way, but the legal system had its own rules. Lauren said she understood, and she was preparing in her own way. Ross paused, weighing whether to say more. Then he spoke softly, almost only for Lauren's ears. If Derek filed first, she'd be forced to chase shadows he built. The sentence hung in the air. Lauren felt it clearly. This was no longer a private duel in the dark. It was a board where whoever moved first held the edge. Ross said goodbye and walked down the path, leaving Lauren on the porch with her pulse pounding. When she turned back inside, Cade didn't ask what Ross had said. He only met her eyes. Lauren said, briefly, that Derek might be about to strike first. Cade nodded slowly, as if he'd already accounted for that possibility. Lauren understood that if she hesitated now, or moved a beat too late, she'd be shoved back into defense again. And this time, she wasn't only protecting her name, she was protecting the classroom door where Abby had just started to breathe like a normal child again. 3 days after the conversation with Detective Keenan, Lauren received a text from an unknown number claiming to be Derek Halston's former assistant, saying there was a packet of documents that could prove her innocence, and asking to meet in person to hand it over. The message was carefully written, not rushed, emphasizing that the sender was afraid of being discovered and couldn't come to her current place. Lauren stared at the screen for a long time before replying. She remembered Ross's warning that if Derek moved first, she would be forced to chase shadows. But she also knew that if any evidence existed beyond the email fragment Tessa had just found, she couldn't afford to ignore it. Lauren told Cade she wanted to meet the person in a parking lot near an old office building, in public, in daylight. Cade didn't argue. He only asked if she was sure. Lauren said she wouldn't get into anyone's car, and she wouldn't go into any enclosed space. Cade nodded and said he would be nearby, but wouldn't appear unless he was needed. When Lauren drove into the lot, noon sunlight beat down on the hot asphalt. A few cars scattered and spaced far apart. She saw a man in a white shirt standing near a gray sedan, holding a thick envelope. Lauren stopped a few yards away, stepped out, and kept her distance. The man spoke quickly, saying he didn't want to be involved but couldn't stay silent while she was treated unfairly. He lifted the envelope and said it contained printed system access history from the old platform. Lauren took one step closer. Not close enough to touch him, but close enough to see the pages inside. She had just reached a hand toward it when a car door slammed open behind her. 2 men in dark jackets appeared. One raised a phone and began recording. The other shouted that they had just caught her taking confidential company materials. Lauren spun around, her heart breaking into a frantic rhythm. The man in the white shirt backed away as if startled, dropped the envelope onto the ground, and in that instant Lauren understood she had walked into a trap. One of them yelled that the police had been called, that she was stealing documents tied to a lawsuit about to be filed. Lauren froze, her mind spiraling. If they could stage this and file a report first, she wouldn't only be facing a professional hearing, she'd be facing a criminal allegation. She thought of Abby, of the questions about stable housing, of how a charge could become a reason for a court to revisit custody. The pieces locked into place with brutal clarity. Derek didn't only want to silence her, he wanted to turn her into a criminal. In the middle of the chaos, a calm voice carried from the far side of the lot. Marla Keats stepped out from an SUV, parked a few spaces away, holding a tablet. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was unmistakably clear. She said the entire area fell under a private security observation contract signed by the lot owner, and the cameras had recorded everything from the moment Lauren arrived. The 2 men hesitated. The one holding the phone lowered it slightly. Marla raised the tablet, and on the screen was a live feed from a camera mounted on a light pole, clearly showing the white shirt man offering the envelope first, and the 2 men appearing right after, as if they'd been waiting. Lauren looked at Marla and understood she hadn't come because Lauren asked. Marla said she had a habit of not letting people from the house go into public places without eyes on them, especially when there had already been warnings about legal traps. Her arrival was unexpected, and precise in a way that felt almost chilling. The 2 men began to back away, claiming it was only a misunderstanding. Lauren felt her knees weaken, but she stayed upright. She looked at the envelope on the ground and didn't pick it up. She said clearly that she hadn't touched any documents, and the cameras had recorded it. One of the men muttered something about calling a lawyer, then pulled the other one away. The man in the white shirt vanished as quickly as he'd appeared. Lauren stood in the middle of the parking lot, the sunlight harsh, yet she felt cold down to the bone. She understood Derek's intent now. Without the cameras, without Marla appearing at the exact right second, a handful of cropped photos could have turned her into the one under investigation for theft, and then custody wouldn't be a hypothetical. Cade appeared from the distance, walking slowly, but with eyes sharp as a blade. He didn't ask if she was all right, because he already knew the answer. He only looked at the envelope on the ground, then looked toward the direction the 2 men had gone. Lauren said softly that Derek wanted to make her a criminal, wanted to put her in a position where she couldn't defend herself. Cade nodded, his voice lowering but not rising in volume. He said it was time to stop being gentle, not with fists or threats, but by stopping the other side from benefiting from politeness. He said they wouldn't wait any longer, and they wouldn't react one beat too late again. Lauren looked at him and understood that it wasn't a promise of violence. It was a declaration of a strategy shift. She drew in a deep breath and felt the fear still there, but no longer numbing her. This time, she wasn't the only one who saw the trap before it snapped shut. After what happened in the parking lot, Lauren knew Derek wouldn't stop at obvious traps. 2 days later, Tessa received a formal proposal requesting a meeting to discuss a civil settlement that could resolve every misunderstanding before either side took further legal steps. The location was a neutral conference room in a downtown office building, with counsel for both sides present. Lauren understood immediately that this was the next move in Derek's strategy. Not a public accusation, but an invitation shaped like reconciliation. Tessa looked at Lauren and said it could be a chance to hear what the other side was really trying to do. Kate asked if she wanted to go. Lauren said yes. She couldn't let her life be negotiated without being in the room. When they walked into the conference room, Derek Halston was already seated, his gray suit flawless, his tie perfectly straight, his smile thin as paper. He stood to shake Tessa's hand first, then looked at Lauren the way you look at an old file pulled from storage. Cade remained behind Lauren, not seated beside her, not stepping into the center. His quiet presence in a room of glass and polished wood made the air feel thicker. Derek began in a courteous tone, saying that recent misunderstandings could harm everyone if they kept escalating. He said he was willing not to pursue any allegation related to the parking lot incident, not to raise the old file again before the professional board, and not to send any further information to Abby's school, on the condition that Lauren sign a non-disclosure agreement and withdraw any complaints currently being prepared. He called it an opportunity for everyone to stay safe. Lauren listened to every word and felt as if she were sitting in a trap lined with velvet. Tessa clarified the terms, asking Derek to confirm in writing that the agreement would not include any admission of wrongdoing by Lauren. Derek smiled and said the agreement wasn't meant to establish right or wrong. It was meant to avoid damage. Lauren understood exactly what that meant. If she signed, her name would never be cleared. The record would stay suspended forever, and at the right moment Derek could lift it again. She glanced at Cade, half expecting him to say something, to decide for her the way powerful men often did. But Cade didn't speak. He only stood behind her, his eyes never leaving her, as if reminding her that this choice was hers. Derek continued, his voice dropping slightly, saying that if Lauren refused, he would be forced to protect his interests. He said there were ambiguities in the temporary guardianship record for Milo, stretches of time when Lauren had no stable address, and if necessary, he could ask the court to reconsider the children's living conditions in the current context. He didn't say he would take the children from her. He only said the system would do its job. The sentence landed like a stone. Lauren felt her heart clamp tight. This was no longer about professional dignity. This was a direct threat to Abby and Milo. She heard her own voice when she answered, steadier than she expected. She said no. The room went quiet for a long beat. Derek tilted his head as if he hadn't heard her. Lauren repeated that she wouldn't sign any agreement that required her silence about what had happened. She said if he wanted to drag everything into the light, she was willing to stand there. Derek looked toward Cade, perhaps expecting a reaction, a counter-threat. But Cade stayed silent and let Lauren finish in her own words. Lauren added that she would not trade her children's future for a manufactured kind of safety. Derek exhaled and said she was choosing the hardest road. Lauren replied that she was used to that. The air in the room turned colder. Tessa closed her folder and said they would not accept the proposal and would proceed with the formal complaint process. Derek stood, adjusted his cuff, and said he hoped Lauren wouldn't regret it. When he passed Cade, their eyes met for a brief second, long enough to make it clear that this fight was no longer a matter of hints. Cade spoke only one line, low but unmistakable, not a threat, but a boundary. He said Derek didn't have the right to bargain with children's lives. Derek didn't answer. He only pressed his lips together and left the room. When the door closed, Lauren realized her hands were shaking. Cade stepped a little closer but still didn't touch her. He asked if she regretted it. Lauren shook her head, even though she knew the road ahead would not be easy. But she also knew one thing for certain. This time, she wasn't going to stay silent in exchange for safety. That night after the meeting with Derek, Lauren didn't go to sleep right away. She stood at the window looking out into the dark yard, while Cade left the house after Abby and Milo were asleep, saying he had something he needed to handle. He drove toward the port, where enormous cranes stood like steel skeletons beneath pale yellow lights, and the sound of metal striking metal carried far on the wind. The ocean night was colder than the city. The wind slapped at his coat, but Cade didn't pull the collar up. He stood at the edge of the dock and looked at the stacked containers, silent blocks holding thousands of stories that would never be told. He remembered a night long ago, when he was a child no one came for, curled up in the back bed of a truck parked near the warehouses, trying to stay warm by hugging his knees tight. He didn't tell it in detail. He didn't tell anyone. Only a single line passed through his mind like an old scar that never disappeared. Some children learn to endure cold before they learn to read. He let out a long breath and turned away, because memory wasn't a reason to stop. It was only a reminder not to turn his back. The next morning, Cade arranged a meeting with a man named Mitchell Crane, the owner of a supply company that had worked with Derek on certain legal and shipping-related contracts. The meeting took place in a glass conference room overlooking the docks, where everything was bright and orderly. Mitchell tried to look confident, but his eyes kept flicking toward the door. Cade sat down without a lawyer, without a bodyguard, with only a thin folder placed in front of him. He didn't mention the parking lot incident. He didn't mention the anonymous letter. He only spoke about a shipment due to arrive next week, and the contract clauses tied to delivery deadlines. Mitchell understood at once what the conversation meant. If a contract was delayed, if a container was held for additional inspection, the supply chain could slow, and customers would start asking questions. Cade didn't threaten. He only asked Mitchell whether he was sure he wanted to keep working with a man who was setting legal traps for a mother. Mitchell swallowed and said he didn't know the whole story. Cade nodded and said he wasn't asking Mitchell to pick a side. He was only asking him to choose the kind of risk he wanted to carry. The meeting didn't last more than 15 minutes. When Cade stood to leave, Mitchell had already called Derek's office to say his company would pause all new contracts until the legal issues were clarified. No shouting, no public threats, only a decision made in silence. That was how Cade operated. When Cade returned home in the late afternoon, he found Abby sitting on the front steps with her legs swinging and her book resting on her knees. She saw him and asked if he worked at the docks. Cade nodded. Abby asked if the docks were cold. Cade looked into the distance, as if he could still hear last night's wind, then said yes. Abby hesitated, then asked a question that made him pause. She asked if he was helping them because he was like them. Cade didn't answer right away. He sat on the step, a small distance from Abby, close enough to hear her clearly but without touching her. He didn't tell a long story. He didn't talk about trucks or nights when nobody came looking. He only said he was here because he knew what cold could do. Abby looked at him for a moment, then nodded as if that answer was enough. Inside, Lauren stood behind the half-open door, heard that line, and felt something in her own wall soften. She didn't know Cade's whole past, and he didn't offer it, but she could see the consistency between his words and his actions. Around the same time, Tessa texted Lauren to say that one of Derek's key partners had just pulled out of a major deal, forcing his firm to restructure its financial plans. Lauren looked at the screen, then looked at Cade, and understood that quiet meetings could shake harder than any overt threat. Cade didn't talk about the meeting at the port. He didn't brag that he'd just made a business relationship wobble. He only asked Abby how school had gone today. Abby told him about a new reading assignment and a spelling quiz, while Lauren watched the two of them and realized power wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was simply the ability to make someone think twice before they kept moving toward a mistake. And when night fell, Lauren knew the fight wasn't over. But at least now she no longer felt like she was standing alone in the cold wind. After the meeting at the port and the quiet withdrawal of a key partner, Lauren could feel the board shifting, but she still didn't dare believe in a turning point that came too easily. Tessa scheduled Lauren and Cade to come to her small office on a windy afternoon, a place where stacks of files sat in neat towers and a whiteboard was crowded with dense notes. When Lauren walked in, she saw that the desk held not only her own file but several others, each folder labeled with a different name. Tessa didn't ease into it. She said that after the deleted email fragment had been recovered, she'd reviewed additional matters connected to Derek Halston over the years. The surprise wasn't in one isolated detail. It was in the repetition of a pattern. Young employees, often women, often people without firm standing, had been accused of the same kinds of violations tied to confidentiality or document handling. Lauren looked at the names and felt like she was staring at other versions of herself. Tessa said she'd reached out to a few of them. At first, most refused to talk out of fear, because they believed speaking up would only make everything worse. But when Tessa mentioned that Lauren had refused a silence deal and was still pursuing the formal process, a few of them changed their minds. The twist didn't come from one piece of evidence. It came from the resonance of many stories. A woman named Carla had once been accused of sending the wrong documents to a competitor. Another, Melissa, had been blamed for a contract that was altered after hours. Both said they were never allowed access to system logs to defend themselves. Tessa opened her laptop and projected onto the screen segments of metadata extracted from the company's old server. There were logins from an internal IP at times when those employees weren't present, and the final edits consistently passed through an account with higher administrator privileges. Lauren stared at the strings of numbers and timestamps, remembering the helplessness she'd felt back then. Tessa said this was no longer the story of one person. It was a pattern of internal record manipulation used to remove people who were inconvenient. Cade sat behind them, silent, not inserting himself into legal analysis. He knew his role wasn't here. The biggest surprise came when Tessa said there was someone still working in Derek's organization who wanted to talk. Lauren immediately thought of betrayal, of another trap. But Tessa said this person wasn't coming because he feared Callahan. He was coming because he'd watched the hearing coverage and heard Lauren refuse the settlement. He said he was used to seeing people bow their heads and sign whatever was put in front of them. This was the first time he'd seen someone say no. The meeting happened quietly in Tessa's office. The man was in his 30s, eyes tired, and he said he'd once been instructed to delete certain internal emails and route documents through a junior employee's account to create false trails. He hadn't kept copies at the time, but the old server's automated backup still retained access logs, and he knew how to show Tessa exactly where to look, down to the right folder. Lauren listened, and felt as if a door that had been locked for years was finally being forced open. The man said he didn't want to keep working in a place where misconduct was called strategy. Cade didn't ask whether he was sure. He didn't promise protection through power. He only nodded once, a silent acknowledgement. Tessa compiled everything into a detailed complaint to the bar, with a request for an independent investigation into falsified records and system manipulation. Lauren looked at those pages and felt as if each line was giving her voice back, and giving it back to the others, too. She knew Derek wouldn't sit still when he received notice of this, but for the first time, she wasn't a single target anymore. This was a chain of dominoes that had started to fall. Tessa closed the file, looked at Lauren, and said they weren't only trying to win one case. They were aiming at the tool Derek had used to threaten people for years. If they could prove a pattern of falsifying internal records, his biggest weapon would lose its power. Lauren drew in a deep breath and felt fear still there, but changing into something else, something close to resolve. Cade looked at her and didn't need to say he'd been ready for this step. Tessa added one more line before they left the office, her voice not loud, but steady with certainty. They weren't only winning a round, they were taking away his weapon. And when Lauren stepped outside, the wind moved through her hair, and she understood that this fight had crossed the boundary of the personal. It was shifting a balance of power she'd once believed she would never even be able to touch. The final hearing took place in a larger hall, no longer the sealed, bright white room of the first session, but a space with rows of seats for the public and local press. Lauren walked in with a steadier stride than before, even though her heart still raced. Abby sat in the second row holding Milo in her lap, hair neatly tied back, her gaze no longer darting away but fixed straight ahead. Cade stood at the very back, not at the center, not giving the impression of control, only a quiet shadow the way he always was. Tessa placed a thick file on the table, packed with printed emails, metadata, and signed statements from witnesses who had agreed to appear. When the hearing began, Lauren didn't wait to be pressed the way she had the first time. She asked to speak first, her voice clear, not shaking. She said she had been a dedicated paralegal, someone who once believed the system protected truth if you did your part the right way. She spoke about her account being used without authorization, about being forced out of the office while she was pregnant, about how every job call afterward ended in silence. But this time she didn't apologize for being a mother. She didn't apologize for not being able to withstand it alone. She said pregnancy was not misconduct, and protecting a child was not a reason to be removed from the profession. The words carried through the hall and created a different kind of quiet, not the silence of suspicion, but the silence of people listening. Tessa then laid out the chain of evidence, from the recovered deleted email fragment to the metadata showing logins from an IP address tied to Derek's office at a decisive time. Then the witnesses were called one by one. Carla spoke about being accused of sending documents to the wrong party, even though she didn't have system access. Melissa described a contract being altered after her work hours. The man who had worked at Derek's company confirmed he'd been instructed to reroute access to create false traces. Each statement was another domino falling. Not loud, but impossible to dismiss. Derek sat across the room, his face still arranged into control, but his hands clenched tight against the edge of the table. When asked to respond, he tried to diminish the credibility of the backups, saying the old system could have been faulty. But Tessa produced confirmation from an independent technology expert on the integrity of the data. Lauren looked at Derek, and for the first time, she didn't see him as taller than her. She saw a man losing the tool he'd relied on for years. In the seats behind them, Detective Ross Keenan was there, watching in silence. When the committee recessed to review, Ross walked over to Lauren. He spoke quietly, saying he'd suspected Callahan might be pulling strings behind the scenes, but he'd seen enough to understand this fight was built on real records, not hidden pressure. Lauren looked at him. She didn't need a public apology. She only needed that acknowledgement. Ross said he'd been wrong to assume power only came from money and fear. When the hearing resumed, the committee announced there was sufficient basis to open a formal investigation into Derek Halston for falsifying records and violating professional ethics. A ripple of murmurs rose through the hall. Lauren didn't celebrate. She only let out a long breath she'd been holding for years. When she turned toward the seats, Abby looked back at her with a brightness Lauren had never seen before. Abby leaned down and whispered, her voice small but unmistakably certain, like a truth that could not be reversed. "Mom, you're not invisible." Lauren felt her throat tighten, and this time the tears were not from defeat. They were from being seen. At the back of the room, Cade's expression softened for a rare moment. He didn't move forward. He didn't claim the victory. He only gave a slight nod when Lauren passed him. Derek left the hall with a faster stride than he'd entered with, the initial confidence gone. Lauren knew the investigation would stretch on, but today a public boundary had been drawn. No more threats in the dark. No more anonymous letters with no signature. She had spoken, and people had listened. And when Abby took her hand as they walked out of the hall, Lauren understood that what mattered most wasn't defeating one man. It was reclaiming her voice for herself and for her child. A few months after the public hearing, the official notice arrived. Derek Halston was suspended from practicing law, while a deeper investigation moved forward into falsified records and professional ethics violations. The news didn't explode the way major television scandals do, but within legal circles it was a shock strong enough to make people who had stayed quiet begin to speak. Lauren didn't celebrate with a party or a statement. She only sat in the small kitchen in Santa Monica, holding the letter confirming her name had been restored, and let out a long breath as if she'd finally been given permission to set down a weight she'd carried for far too long. A few weeks later, she accepted a job with a nonprofit legal organization that specialized in helping employees who'd been wrongfully terminated and single mothers tangled in procedural trouble. It wasn't a glamorous position, but it was work that made her feel her voice mattered. Abby kept going to school, no longer lowering her head when the teacher called her name, and Milo grew up in a home with lit windows and nights without the roar of traffic overhead. Cade was still there, but he didn't take up the space. He kept the boundaries Lauren had set from the first day, respecting every decision she made. Their romance wasn't made of loud vows. It was made of evenings cooking together, of taking Abby to parent-teacher meetings, of looks of understanding across a kitchen bright with light. One ordinary evening, while Lauren washed dishes and Abby worked on homework at the table, Cade walked into the kitchen with his familiar, steady calm. He didn't kneel. He didn't bring a sparkling ring box. He only looked at Abby first, then asked in a slow voice whether he could become home for her. Abby looked up, glanced at her mother, then at Cade. Her eyes far more grown than the child who had once stood on tiptoe in a supermarket. She nodded and said home wasn't the place without wind. It was the place where someone didn't turn their back. Lauren set her hands on the edge of the sink, water running softly behind her, and understood that the simplicity of that proposal carried more than any ring ever could. Years later, when Abby was grown, she returned to the very supermarket where everything had begun. She ran into Megan, the cashier who had once frozen in front of a box of milk and a promise. Abby smiled and placed a small envelope on the counter, clearly labeled with money for milk and a donation to a fund that supported families in temporary hardship. She said there were cold nights that could change a life, and there were people who chose not to turn away. The circle closed not with revenge, but with giving. This story reminds us that power doesn't only live in the ability to make others afraid. it also lives in using influence to protect what is right. Truth can be hidden for a while, but when enough people dare to stand tall, the dominoes will fall. And sometimes, what saves a child isn't a miracle. It's an adult choosing to step back exactly one pace to respect a boundary. When a new report from the port surfaced about a missing container and an unfamiliar name began targeting Callahan, Cade knew the fight wasn't over. But this time, he wasn't only protecting his empire, he was protecting his family. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, tap like, and share to spread stories of humanity every day. How did this story make you feel? And did you see yourself or someone you love in it? Leave a comment so we can hear what's in your heart. Hello, and see you in the next video. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace each day.